So my background is in digital design, and more specifically design for digital archives. The experience working with digital archives started with my PhD research about 5-6 years ago, when I was working with a born digital art organization called Rhizome, based in the States. And they had this very extensive archive of net art from the 90s, and they needed better preservation strategies to preserve this archive, but also better presentation strategies to present the work in this archive, which consisted of different kinds of mediums, software-based art, but also some video and mainly web-based art. Starting to think through questions of how digital archives can be represented to different kinds of audiences and made more accessible, also made more collaborative, was some of the key questions I was dealing with. And since then, I've started working on more diverse cultural heritage projects. So over the last 2-3 years, I have worked with smaller archives of individual artists like John Jonas, performance artist, and also at the moment in my current position here in Germany, I work for the NFDI for Culture initiative, where we are trying to build software that can be used for cultural heritage research data. So I hope I can bring in some different perspectives here. I think there are basically several challenges. While it may not be quite as challenging as net art per se, because net art can really be very difficult because of its heterogeneous data formats. Still, I think with websites we face problems that traditional archives haven't had to deal with. Therefore, we don't have as many both technical but also policy-based approaches to deal with this. And so I was thinking about this question a bit earlier, and I actually wanted to write down, I think there's 5 things we can think about in terms of challenges, and I won't go into all of them now because we can have a discussion later, but I think we have to think about the ethical challenge of getting consent, right? All of this data that we consider public on the web technically introduces a lot of challenges for intellectual property that people who work in web archives still haven't fully resolved, so that's an ongoing challenge. There's technical challenges in terms of how do we preserve the interactivity in websites that use different technologies, and also how do we preserve interface elements that change over time. Sometimes for websites it may be important not only using certain HTML or CSS tags, but also things like how the browser looks, what are the browser capabilities, and those things are temporary, bound to different periods in time, and they are outside the control of the artists themselves. So that's something that kind of transcends net art, and also we can apply it also to basic websites. There's also curatorial challenges, right? Like how do you select and identify what to preserve and where to draw the boundaries around the archive, because a website isn't a self-contained thing. It contains links to many other resources, and where do you draw the boundary of okay, this is actually meaningful to stop crawling at this point because, let's say, it just starts spilling too far outside the artist's work. Same thing with social media. Artists build interesting portfolios on different social platforms, but these portfolios may oftentimes link to external resources. So I think this kind of curatorial boundary drawing is very interesting challenge. There's the cataloging challenge, which is primarily, there's many perspectives on that, but I think primarily interesting to think about how do we classify, and maybe we need to build new taxonomies around these websites. Are they documentation? Sometimes they could be considered artworks in themselves. So how do we relate the websites, the information on them, the documentation about other artworks, and the body of work of the artist per se? And also, how do we connect any kind of catalog or index around websites to other databases that may contain information on the more what we might consider more traditional collections of artists, right? So an artist might have artworks in several Berlin galleries. How do we connect the fact that these artworks are there with what is documented on the website, etc., etc.? And last but not least, I think the sustainability challenge is very important to think about. This goes into this idea of policy, right? The fact that we don't actually have very sustainable policies for web archives on a national but also international level, and so we have to think about who is responsible for archiving these things, how can we make them last for a long time, etc. Yeah, so I think drawing on the experience that we had at Rhizome, again, it's net art, but I think we can extrapolate certain characteristics onto more traditional websites as well. There is the challenge of archiving the actual code behind the website, right? And there's the challenge of the fact that using heterogeneous technologies inside these websites may mean that traditional crawlers that maybe just gather HTML and CSS from these websites, that traditional method of web archiving might not be able to then display accurately the interactive elements. There's also this kind of idea of like, what do we lose when we only scrape the raw data underneath? We lose a lot of the visual experience, and oftentimes that visual experience can only be, let's say, served through particular technologies. So we go into the direction of like, emulation, or thinking about alternative web archiving strategies like the web recorder project that was started at Rhizome, but now it's its own separate kind of family of open source tools, and that's something that could be interesting to look at. But I think on the other edge of thinking about cataloging and taxonomies and categorizations, I think it's also very important to establish new terms and vocabularies. How do we talk about these websites in relation to other parts of the body of work of an artist, right? And I think that's definitely something to consider. And what kinds of then database technologies can preserve this kind of ever-growing, classification that is not something that can easily be summarized like typical data models for art like CDOC-CRM or other things that you might know from art history world. I think for me, as a visual person, for me it's very important to definitely try to preserve to some degree the visuality of these things, right? To preserve the experience of the websites as they are experienced now in a browser. But trying to think more from the data perspective, if you say, yes, we'll have some sort of archive running, and maybe we'll have some sort of interface to look at and browse the archive, but like thinking about what can be discovered in these archives, in these data sets. I think something that we don't necessarily see typically in, say, collections of galleries that have just lists of artworks, is the networks between artists. And I think if we think about Berlin and the scene in Berlin, that's like a super interesting thing. How do people work with each other? So one thing that I would be curious is trying to use more innovative methods to mine for entities among the data of basically people entities, and then seeing how they work together, how they interact with each other. What do they do? Do they just have exhibitions together? Do they actually work together on projects? I think that would be interesting. And then the exhibition histories, of course, I think is something that also quite naturally is probably interesting to researchers. But I would also be interested to think about, and I can't answer this because I'm not an artist, but I think it would be interesting once you're doing the kind of curatorial work and working on getting consent from people to maybe talk to them and ask them what would they like to get out of some kind of visualization that spans multiple websites, right? I wonder what artists could get out of it, because I think historians or researchers, we could say, we want exhibition histories or we want networks of relations between people, but I think it would be a very interesting challenge to talk to artists about this. You could look at it from different projects. I think Rhizome, what they have done is to make their archive valuable somehow over time, both to artists and to researchers, because researchers see it as this like historical, piece of history that doesn't exist anywhere else. So it is valuable from that perspective, but also artists, of course, they want to be able to go back and, see what their peers were doing at a certain period in time. And I mean, for many artists who have their works in the Artbase archive, they don't have actually that work anymore themselves. So it's the only place where they can, actually get access to that work. And they, Rhizome have worked with individual artists to really restore some pieces properly, because just an archive alone usually doesn't guarantee, functionality. But anyway, to your question about what can you do, I mean, I think really understanding, that's what I kind of went back to this question, understanding first what artists would like to do with an archive like this, how it can be useful to them. And then the next thing is getting support from some kind of a host institution that would be interested in running this in the long term. Because what Rhizome did in the early 2000s, when they were starting to run out of enough resources to do everything themselves, they made an affiliation with the New Museum in New York, right? So ultimately, as maybe kind of cliche as it sounds, affiliating a project that may be grassroots and artists initiated with a more stable institutional infrastructure is just something that, of course, the New Museum doesn't provide funding for the archive, but it provides a kind of stable base where then the people running the archive can continue to apply for more funding or different sources, etc. So it's a kind of double strategy, I think, of both, engaging what is your audience, like researchers, artists, maybe both, and trying to better understand what they would get out of it and therefore serve better to that user need, but then also thinking about what, this goes into the policy question that I was also bringing up, like, who should be, in theory, in an ideal world, who is responsible for this kind of work, and then maybe trying to establish some sort of an affiliation with that kind of institution.